Hello, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Stratfor Talks, our monthly podcast that takes you into global affairs. I'm Ben Sheen.
And I'm Marla Moore.
And we're your hosts for the show. There are two segments to our show today. First, Europe analyst Mark Fleming-Williams will be here to discuss the latest existential question about the future of the European Union. And then we'll chat with security expert Fred Burton about the anniversary of the Iran hostage crisis and the lasting ways in which the 1979 incident changed diplomatic security practices and procedures.
Don't forget, if you have questions for Stratfor analysts or suggestions for future podcast topics, drop us a line at stratfor.com/podcast/feedback. Or connect with us on Facebook or Twitter with your comments. Our handle is @Stratfor. And with that, on with the show.
We'll start today by looking forward to December, when the European Council will hold another scheduled meeting. They're expected to discuss, amongst other things, the UK's referendum on EU membership and the Five Presidents' report. That report, by the way, is a document that was produced in June that lays out a roadmap for future integration among EU members, another hot topic.
The Council was actually supposed to discuss the Five Presidents' report back in September, but this was put on hold, reportedly because two core EU states, France and Germany, apparently have such deep disagreements about their visions for Europe that a senior official said it would be dangerous to pursue a public discussion at that time.
Mark Fleming-Williams is here now to explain a little bit more. Europe appears to be in something of a pickle at the moment. We've got the immigration crisis, the Greek crisis, the looming spectre of the European debt crisis, a north-south divide, political extremism on the rise, and constant bickering among the flagship countries. And in the midst of all this, you have Brussels trying to retain the core vision of the European Union. I mean, for now, I'm quite glad I live in America, but can it get any worse for Europe?
Well, Ben, you describe it as a pickle at the moment, but I would say it's actually been in a pickle for quite a while. The story of Europe has been integration ever since its kind of founding in the years in the decade after the Second World War, and it's been getting closer and closer together. But I would say that the foundations potentially of this latest pickle actually came about with the formation of the European Monetary Union and the start of the euro in 2000, which saw 8 years of prosperity and good times, but underneath that was forming kind of debt issues and problems, which have really come to the fore in the 7 years since 2008. The things that you describe, I mean, the sovereign crises, the sovereign debt crises, the bickering, a lot of that can be traced back to this step that was taken to form the eurozone, and it's not going away. I mean, these situations are continuing to get worse. So I wouldn't say it's anything new. It's been the status quo for a little while now.
You know, really, we're talking about going back to the reason for the European Union being formed in the first place, which was a peace and prosperity project, which worked wonderfully until there was not so much prosperity. And before that, there was not so much peace. So I wonder if you might be able to talk to us a bit about the shape of Europe and going back, a good century or so when we had so much warfare and so much conflict between the main powers, and how that gave rise to the concepts behind the European Union and then the monetary union as part of that.
The idea behind Europe and the reason why it kind of came about in the first place was as an obvious result of World War II. It was, Europe trying to pull itself together with America's help after World War II. World War II came out of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and the some would say unfair peace, but the unbalanced peace. And it could be said that World War I came out of the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, which itself was the unifier which formed Germany. The concert of Europe, which existed before 1871, before the unification of Germany, was essentially this post-Napoleon system of a balance of power between the five powers of Europe, which all had a reasonable balance between themselves, a balance of strengths, and they all kind of agreed not to break the peace. And there were little dalliances with that. The Crimean War, of course, between France and Britain and Russia on the other side was something like that. But it was generally a balanced situation. But then the formation of Germany created a force which was much more powerful than the other players on the continent, and it was also everyone else had their empire, and the Germans wanted to get their own as well. So basically, it was the formation of Germany which unsettled that balance. And so as a result, when we get to the end of World War II, and we're trying to think how Europe's leaders are trying to think how they can create a system which is going to recreate a new form of balance, then that is where the European Union kind of suggestion grows out of. It's the idea of tying France and Germany so close together. Germany wouldn't feel the need to, or the unbalance wouldn't show itself in Europe because everyone was all part of one brotherly harmony, beautiful project.
And as we know, the French and the Germans do get along very well. So one of the ironies is that, you know, the European Union, in its role to sort of lock Germany into an economic alliance with its neighbours and make future war, you know, an untenable thing, we've seen Germany rise to become incredibly powerful within the Union itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So Germany obviously was divided after World War II as well, and East Germany became part of, under the sway of the Soviet Union. Taking the story onwards to kind of 1992 area, then you get the fall of the Soviet Union, you get East Germany coming out, and so potentially being formed reattached to Western Germany, and Germany becoming one country again. And at that stage, what we see is a lot of the more geopolitically minded leaders, Thatcher particularly in Britain, were quite wary about this idea of forming a unified Germany for that very kind of German question idea, which I touched on earlier. And part of the deal, which would allow this to happen, this reunification at that stage, was that, again, you would get the next step in unity, which was the introduction of monetary union, which the French were very keen on as an idea. They'd constantly been tying themselves currency-wise to the Germans, but then having to, because the Germans believed in having a strong currency, fiscal stability, and kind of austerity as a way of life in an economic sense. The French often found themselves in the preceding decades having to go cap in hand to the Germans and asking the Germans to strengthen their currency against the franc, because it was embarrassing for the French to weaken the franc against the German Deutschmark. So the French liked the idea of attaching themselves to and sharing that the benefits of all that German austerity and German responsibility over the years by creating that monetary union. And the monetary union was a French plan, which was in a way part of the quid pro quo of what the Germans had to sort of go along with in order to be allowed to reunify. And so we see the 90s of the Germans digesting East Germany, which was obviously much poorer at that stage than West Germany, having been behind the Iron Curtain. And then, as you say, from the beginning of this century and the beginning of from 2000 onwards, then you've got a reunified Germany, which has also now got the merits, and there are benefits, let's not forget, for Germany in the Eurozone, because it makes the German currency that much cheaper. And actually that Germany, which is such an export-led economy, really benefits from having a weak currency, because then it's very easy to be more competitive than in the global market.
Well, isn't it really rather ironic, though, that the place that we find ourselves today is France and Germany have had this dream together for quite some time. France came up with it, Germany liked it, but today what we're hearing is their visions are now so different that they're afraid to discuss them in public because it would be dangerous to the idea of the union. How did we get there?
Yeah, it was that kind of point of no return aspect of joining the currencies, but without that fiscal union, with unwilling to give up the tax and spend powers, which basically created a situation where the periphery of Europe, so let's not forget, this isn't just Germany and France, this is the North and the rest of Europe together. And it allowed the periphery of Europe while Germany was enjoying that benefit of a cheaper currency, the rest of Europe was enjoying German interest rates as well, because there was the feeling that, or the market impression that Germany was kind of underwriting countries like Greece and Portugal and these countries, which meant that they could borrow at these cheap rates. And so you ended up having this very deep, this decade of debt accumulation in the south, and ultimately, when the carousel stopped in 2008, then that all became very clear, and we were left with a very different Europe. When it comes to it, this monetary union aspect was the next step in binding, but without the fiscal union, it allowed these imbalances to build up. From a German perspective, what they would have liked was to be able to have a fiscal union allowing them to perhaps be more regulatory on these peripheral economies, to perhaps make them more like Germany, and make them more austere, fiscally responsible. Whereas what these southern European countries would have preferred was for a union to be a little bit more about sharing the wealth, and a little bit. So what the Southern European states picture is a European Union which is a little bit like what Germany experienced when the West joined the East, a kind of allowing that wealth to flow from the rich side to the poor side, and equalize the country, the overall kind of country, or the overall unit over time. Thus, we have two very different ideas, the German and the French, let's say the French, although they are leaders of the periphery in this, in terms of what they'd like to see the European Union become. And that's very divisive when it comes to actually taking things forward.
And it is one of the curses of the European Union that actually, even when most countries can agree on an end state, they can't all agree on how to get there. And again, just trying to get all the countries in the Union to agree on a single thing is virtually impossible, isn't it?
It is. So what we've ended up with is the Greeks, for example. The Greeks are kind of the epicenter of this issue, because they're so indebted. They're such extreme versions of what we've seen in Portugal and Spain to a lesser extent, that we have seen these repeated crises where the Greeks are looking for essentially help paying their debts, which to the Germans look like transferring money from Germany to Greece, which is very uncomfortable. And so you've ended up with a situation which Germany is finding itself being dragged deeper into a transfer union it would like to avoid. But then on the other side, we get so in 2012, when this debt crisis came to a head, then we get a kind of German-led riposte and a German-led solution to it, which is a much more fiscally responsible mechanism coming from Brussels, and it's all about austerity, and we get that being kind of stamped down on the rest of Europe, and a lot of that actually has led, and it was one of those crises that you mentioned in your introduction. This has caused a lot of that nationalistic, more extreme anti-austerity kind of politics coming out, as well as this kind of public lashback against this drive. So you've seen Germany trying to create a Europe in its own image, and you've seen the backlash against it. And so now we're in a situation where it's a potential seesaw moment where there are forces beginning to move against austerity, and it could start heading the other way.
Well, it's been very interesting because since they postponed the Five Presidents report, France and Germany have made sort of a big public show of how much we absolutely agree on everything, and making joint addresses, in various meetings together. But at the end of the day, really the point of division between them has to do with national identity and vision and geography, in a sense. I mean, geography, as we discuss it in this context at Stratfor, is very much a tremendous factor in capital formation. Can you speak to why geography dictates that you have a rich north and a poor south, and that really is the crux of the issue.
If you look at a map of Europe, then it's got some very distinctive features. To the north, you have this long, straight plain stretching from France all the way across to Russia, essentially. And also in the north, you've got these river systems, essentially, which are a collection of thick, navigable rivers, which go to the sea, obviously, which are useful for transporting goods and for communication within the north of Europe. And then by contrast, if you look at the south of Europe, places like Spain, Italy, Greece, you see many more mountains, you see many fewer navigable rivers, you see much more rugged terrain. And what that does is it creates communication barriers between cultures, even within, for example, the landmass of the peninsula of Spain and Portugal. And that creates a very divisive kind of tribal kind of development of culture. And this is what we see. Is through the history, you tend to see some of the richer states being in the north and the poorer states being in the south. So this is one of those kind of geographical facts of Europe. It has been overcome when the global attention has moved, for example, to the New World. Spain's position to vis-a-vis the New World actually caused it to get rich for a while. But actually, in terms of capital generation, it tends to be accumulating more in the north than the south.
Right. If you can colonize a certain part of the world and extract the wealth from it, then that certainly worked to their advantage for a certain period of time. But Absolutely. Intrinsically, they are sort of bound by their geography to farming or, very little ability to export or manufacture.
And let's not forget as well that Europe is still looking to expand. You had this expansion into Central Europe and some of the former communist countries in 2004 and 2007. You had Bulgaria and Romania join the Union. And most recently in Ukraine, the sort of a lot of that kerfuffle evolved from talk of moving to the West.
Yeah, behind that was particularly from a Western European perspective, they have demographic issues. They tend to be quite aging. They are to some extent at the leading edge of kind of efficiencies, and they're not too far from America in terms of GDP per capita. So there's not that much clear growth to be had. Whereas the vision behind expanding to the east was more towards trying to develop trying to basically attach themselves to the potential for growth from the east, from countries like Poland, which have grown extremely well since 1991. So there is the expansion eastwards was potentially more to kind of harness themselves to a fast growing region.
You talk a lot about the geography and the trade and the monetary union and everything, but actually another one of the key tenets of Europe is actually the movement of people, or should I say the free movement of people across Europe itself. And one of the interesting things we've seen from the immigration crisis is a real inability to kind of craft together a coherent asylum policy, and it really sort of undermines the whole European ideal, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is really breaking it down to a very Stratfor view of Europe, because the problem with Europe, the problem with the European Union, which we haven't touched on yet, which is the core issue, is in the geography, and that is that we've had 2,000 years of many divisions within the continent. You've had 2,000 years of France squabbling with Spain, Britain usually squabbling with France, and and with Scotland when it's separate. You've got a long history of development in a divided manner, and it's divided by the geography. We talked about domestically within Spain, but don't forget that between Spain and France, you've got the Pyrenees, which causes divisions, which forms those separate cultures. Between France and Italy, you've got the Alps. It's this combination of capital generation, but also barriers, which creates these issues. So when the wonderful idea to create and it is a wonderful idea, don't get me wrong, to create the European Union is brought about, then everyone agrees this is a great idea. But when you get an end of prosperity, which is what happened in 2008, and you start getting very high unemployment and high debt and economic issues, add that to things like immigrants arriving in your country and crossing borders and streaming through Austria to get to Germany and you know, gathering at Calais to try and cross to the UK, then that's when those historic tensions emerge and those historic identities, and Germans start raising or enforcing borders with Austria, saying, this is not our problem. We want to keep it out of Germany and in Austria. And in Germany's defence, Germany's been one of the best in terms of accepting immigrants. It's just an example. So this is the immigration crisis is quite a useful way to. It kind of exposes those fractures and those differences. Which, to use an example, and you know, Winston Churchill talked about a United States of Europe in 1945, very much thinking of the United States of America at the time. It's hard to imagine in the same way Florida enforcing its borders because immigrants were flowing into its neighbor, saying this isn't our problem. This is not a Floridan problem. It's for Florida. It's very much part of the country. So this is immigration is the latest example. As a result, it is the latest eroding force at these ties that were created to bind the European Union together since its beginning.
They are two separate problems, but they can't be separated from each other because Europe, contiguously, if you think about it in that way, the discussion is, do we get closer together or do we move further apart? And getting closer together sounds great, except that nobody can actually agree on how to get that done. And if you actually start to move further apart, where does that process stop for the contiguous union? And that's one part of it. And the other part, I think you're saying, is that, you have the migration crisis is happening in tandem with this internal conversation. And the question of identity is not only what is the European identity or identities for the contiguous landmass, it is also how will the flow of migration change those identities, and can we withstand that?
Yeah, very much. We're at a stage now where the level of integration, the Eurozone monetary union without fiscal union has been shown to be unworkable going forwards in its current makeup. So the question is, do we go forwards or do we go back? Because we can't stay where we are. And as you say, the problem with going back is that once you start unraveling the ties that bind, it builds the momentum towards separating, basically, and that road essentially leads to separate countries. And this is why throughout its history, Europe's leaders have been very careful about taking any backward steps, and so that leaves pointing forwards and integrating further. So following the latest iteration of the Greek crisis, which we saw for the first half of this year, and it was kind of solved in July, but it was solved in quite a harmful way, where France and Germany were clearly on opposite sides. France had to convince Germany to kind of accept Greece is remaining in the Eurozone, essentially. So it was quite divisive at that stage, and it became clear that the next step was going to be discussing the future integration of Europe. But we saw this PR decision to kind of hold hands, and France and Germany to pretend that everything is okay, just to calm things down a little bit. And we saw France and Germany, President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel making a speech in the European Parliament together for the first time since 1989 that a French and German leaders have done that. So these kind of PR touchy-feely things that they've been doing, but it was particularly interesting that when the time came, or was supposed to be coming, to discuss, as you mentioned, the future of Europe, they decided actually that sounds a little meaty, and we quite enjoy this kind of PR fluff period at the moment, and so it was delayed until December. So basically, it's going to have to come, this conversation. They're going to have to decide, and Germany wants. The problem is when they have this decisive conversation, the Germans want to talk about fiscal regulation. They want to talk about creating new institutions to oversee the southern European countries in order to keep them in check and make them more German in the end. And the French ideally really want to talk about transfer union and how they can create more. So the discussion, for example, around banking union and creating a general deposit insurance, meaning that Eurozone banks would bail each other out when they get into trouble. And to Germans, that sounds like creating the opportunity again for those peripheral countries to borrow on the German checkbook. It's these deep, differing visions of what Europe should be looking like, which cause so many problems, which cause this delay in this subject, but which are going to have to be faced, particularly as Ben mentioned in the introduction, with the UK referendum coming up in the next couple of years, because the UK referendum is all about getting a renegotiation first, trying to change the shape, sort out the shape of Europe, which is going to best suit the UK, and then let the British public decide whether they want to remain in under those terms or not. So the UK is going to be asking these questions, and with the rest of Europe very much wanting UK to remain, they're going to have to be dealing with the questions, but potentially.
You touched on it earlier, but it does seem that one way or another, Germany really is the power at the heart of Europe, and whether there's agreement or disagreement with France, this is where the largesse is coming from that's holding that union together for the foreseeable future. And they're certainly not going to disunify themselves, as going back to the concert of Europe state of being. So it does seem that the German question is going to be there one way or another for quite some time to come.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Europe has historically tended to be worried about one of its countries at any stage. So back in the 16th century, it was the fear of the Habsburgs and the danger that they, Spain and Austria combined, would kind of swamp the rest of Europe and take over the whole continent. And this is where, again, those identities show themselves. This kind of British and French kind of individualism and separatism shows itself and resists and gathers together to resist. So that was then, and then you've got Napoleon doing his thing in the beginning of the 19th century, and again, all the powers get together to kind of get it under control and ultimately defeat it at Waterloo, and then the unification of Germany in 1871 just creates this latest. Now everyone's been worried. We're living in the German age in a way. Everyone's worried about what happens with Germany, and Europe at the moment is the latest answer to that question. It's a much less violent answer than the previous two, but it is the answer to the question. It's held up for 60 odd years, but we're currently seeing those ties that connect that answer together being eroded, coming under strain, and it's an interesting moment in terms of Europe, the monetary union not working at the moment, and the question of the need to either progress or retreat, and the deep difficulties in actually progressing at this stage, which the situation has the potential that there may be no option but to ultimately retreat. So there are various crossroads in the history of Europe, and this could be one that we're approaching.
Well, it's definitely something that we'll be keeping an eye on and talking about much, much more in the future. So, Mark, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Mark, thank you.
The month of November this year marks the 36th anniversary of the Iran hostage crisis, the day when a group of Iranian students overran the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. The diplomatic crisis that followed lasted 444 days, ending with the Algiers Accords, signed just moments after President Ronald Reagan was sworn into office.
The 1979 hostage crisis was a watershed moment for the U.S. intelligence community and for the field of diplomatic security. And Fred Burton, Stratfor's Vice President of Intelligence, joins us now to explain why. So Fred, you've got a lot of experience in this field, both as a practitioner, an advisor, and occasionally as an investigator when things go wrong. What was the state of diplomatic security prior to the Tehran incident in 1979?
Ben, it was pretty poor. When you look at just the manpower that the State Department had in those days when they were known as the Office of Security, or SY, there was probably 300 agents worldwide, and they were more regionally based. However, we did have a regional security officer, an agent by the name of Al Golozinski, that was actually in Tehran and was there when the embassy was overran, and he ended up being a hostage for that year.
We have a generation of Americans now who are too young to remember 9/11, let alone anything that happened in 1979. And I wonder, especially for that part of our audience, if you could spend a few moments just describing how truly different the mindset was for Americans specifically who may have been living or working overseas or particularly in the Middle East back in that era.
Well, the fascinating part with the benefit of looking back now in the rearview mirror is that 79 was certainly a watershed moment, not only for the Foreign Service, but it was one of these years where we also had the attack in Islamabad, Pakistan, which the U.S. diplomatic mission was set on fire. And then the lead up to that, remember in the early 70s, we had a whole wave of Black September Palestinian attacks and the Munich massacre at the Olympics. And then we had U.S. diplomats killed in Khartoum. We had the U.S. ambassador and an economics counselor kidnapped and assassinated in Beirut in 1976. So the Foreign Service was a very dangerous place to be, like it is today in the 1970s. You just didn't have it resonate inside of everybody's home and in our social media world as we do today, like we've seen as a result of Benghazi.
So it would be fair to say that although the threat existed at that time, it wasn't felt in the deeply visceral way that perhaps Americans who see beheadings on videos and other things of this nature feel it in a personal sense today. It was known and felt within the intelligence community and diplomatic circles, but not down to the level of average Americans living and traveling.
Correct. But when you look at certain key events such as the U.S. Embassy seizure in Tehran, that was nightly news every day, and it was in the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, and there was daily updates on that. You would have to look hard inside of the Washington Post and the New York Times for 2 or 3 lines of other kinds of incidents that happened against not only American diplomats, but any other foreign diplomats around the world. And there was a general perception, I think, having grown up in that time period, that this is an acceptable risk. You know, we had come out of Vietnam, you had diplomats all over the world, and that if you're in these places, bad things do happen. And if something does go wrong in these places, you might get 2 or 3 lines about it in a major national newspaper.
So it's one thing reading about it in the newspaper, but it's another thing entirely actually being there on the ground as well. There was this awareness of a deterioration situation in Iran off the back of the Iranian Revolution, from where the Shah really started to get challenged in October 1977, all the way through to his exile in January 1979. The situation was getting worse on the ground, and actually some steps were taken, such as thinning out the number of diplomatic staff, but still, it was recognized as being a secure location, American territory in another location, effectively.
Spot on, Ben. Also remember that this was also deemed to be a tremendous forecasting and intelligence failure by many, meaning our inability to monitor the deteriorating situation with the tripwires that really weren't in place in that time. And if you fast forward to Benghazi, there's a big study as to what kind of tripwires should be in place, so you know when you start to pull back and you start to remove diplomats. But when you look at it from a sheer tactical perspective with Tehran, the things that came out of Tehran, to me, really formulated my early career as an agent, because we started to focus on hostage debriefings, emergency action plans, setting up offices for contingency planning. But at the end of the day, when the host government by Geneva Accord is responsible for the safety and welfare of all official Americans or any diplomat in that respective nation, it can be from any country, and that deteriorates, much like we saw in Tehran or we saw in Benghazi, that's where countries really need to assess and evaluate, do we really need a footprint in these countries? So in essence, when you look at Tehran, there's so many security variables that came out of that. And one of the basics ones really centered on hostage rescue. Delta, JSOC, organizations coming in to try to forcibly rescue American diplomats or diplomats held in a foreign country. And we all know what happened with the ill-fated rescue attempt, which has been attributed to the Carter legacy of failure with diplomacy in the Middle East and so forth. But I know that just inside my old organization, that as a result of Tehran, steps were made to create contingency plans and emergency action plans and have better planning and contingencies in the works in order to bring diplomats out in hostile environments.
Can you step us back through what those early days at the Office of Diplomatic Security actually were like for you? Because you were in the early 80s. This was a very recent memory in the big scheme of things. And it was visceral for, I think, almost anyone who was involved in the intelligence community or in diplomatic security. What were the first points of professionalism that you were taught as a result of the Iran hostage crisis?
Well, I vividly recall the case files of Tehran in our safe and on my desk, and I was tasked by my boss to study those and to look at those debriefing reports. And there were so many lessons learned in that event that we as an organization, the Office of Security and the State Department, were ill prepared for. And some of the steps that we saw come directly out of that was emergency action plans, meaning what do you do when things go south and you're in a country where you can't depend upon the local nationals to help protect your diplomatic facility, and it's just you, maybe by yourself, one single agent, and a Marine Security Guard detachment. What are you going to do? And you're fostering liaisons with other friendly nations such as the Brits and the Canadians and the Aussies and trying to work collectively to evaluate certain situations. You're trying to stay on top of the threat. You're working hand in glove with the CIA to try to develop tactical intelligence. You're trying to figure out how you can get your people out of country, for example, either by air or over land or even by sea. So Tehran spun off a half a dozen different offices inside of Foggy Bottom alone, focusing solely on crisis management and emergency action plans. And then another important variable that we learned was the criticality of exercises, meaning let's put together scenarios where you have similar events take place and game board them with actual senior officials playing certain roles and inserts or injects coming with, okay, you've lost the embassy or terrorists are claiming that they're holding the U.S. ambassador hostage. What do you do next? And you try to look at the effectiveness of your response capability. But I can tell you this, the one big thing that came out of Tehran that I've also vividly recall, much like we saw in Benghazi too, many years later, was that at times your help is an aircraft carrier away. And it's a big world, and you've got a lot of diplomats in a lot of strange places around the globe. And trying to get American help, even with our power and how we project power, is very difficult to do. So maybe in some cases it's best to look towards our allies, such as the Brits or the Canadians or the Aussies, to say, we need help here, and we need to roll the cavalry.
It's interesting because one of the takeaways from Benghazi was actually having a mobile Marine contingent positioned to respond to a number of different locations in the region and a number of eventualities. That was one of the things you mentioned earlier about Operation Eagle Claw, which was the hostage rescue mission that was sent out to retrieve the hostages. It showed the complexity of actually getting a force overseas to a staging area from which they could conduct the operation and then recover. It was a hugely complex operation and it didn't quite come off, but it did reveal a lot of planning factors that were carried forward into the 80s, 90s, and to the current day.
Without a doubt, Ben, and you know the importance of coordination in the special forces community and trying to engage with that, which is another takeaway from this that you could do a PhD thesis on, studying what went wrong just from the military rescue aspect, not to mention what went wrong in Tehran, which certainly has spun off movies and books like Argo to describe the ordeal that the Americans went through. And the other fascinating thing to me on a personal level is I've got to know one of the hostages quite well, and he certainly helped me in my Benghazi book as well. And we were chatting about this week, and this was a long time ago, but it's still very fresh in all these victims' minds. And I hearken back to my days of doing hostage debriefings of all the hostages held in Lebanon in that time. And I think that when you go through an event like this is the kind of thing that much like the POWs at the Hanoi Hilton, these are the kinds of things that are with you forever. You may not ever be able to get over them.
There was a lot of psychological torment undergone by the people held within the embassy itself. It was 444 days, and they were subjected to all sorts of terrible things. Mock executions, people were threatened with having their feet cooked in burning oil, there was physical abuse, there was a lot of torment. People actually tried to kill themselves in the embassy, and they carried those traumatic experiences forward to the current day.
I can vividly recall those days as a teenager, thinking of, my goodness, why can't somebody do something? And then put yourself in that hostage shoes, and here you are halfway around the world. Our government has sent you to carry out your job in a diplomatic capacity. You're an accredited diplomat. This is the last thing you're ever thinking is going to happen when you're in one of these places, but then it does. And on any given day, these folks could have been killed. Things could have gone very badly if Eagle Claw had been successful. You don't know the outcome there. So to me, when you look back on Tehran, embassy security has come a long way, predominantly even with Benghazi. And we all know there's enough fault in Benghazi. We could spend another 2 or 3 hours talking about that alone. But if you look at Tehran, 79 in Tehran kind of changed the whole influx of new hires, and then of course in the early 80s when we had the horrific embassy bombings in Beirut, that's when guys and gals like me were hired because the threat really started to tempo up to the point that Americans were being targeted literally all over the globe with not only hostage takings but aircraft hijackings and kidnappings of all sorts and so forth.
I'd like to ask you a couple of different questions because it's fascinating to me when you talk about this string of threats that existed for diplomats around the world prior to the Iran hostage crisis and prior to the Islamabad embassy burning in that same year. What were the root cause analyses and the after-action reports like for the intelligence community? Because there had to be lessons learned from that.
There really were, but I can tell you that they consisted mostly in old brown accordion folders in our office with maybe news clippings and Phoebus and Reuters and BBC news reports of what transpired, and you were lucky to have a cable or a telegram that described the event, and maybe you had a witness statement there. Remember, until 1984, it wasn't a crime to kill an American overseas, for example. So there wasn't really a lot of official investigations at times. So SY, the predecessor of Diplomatic Security Service, would dispatch a regional security officer to try to look into things and try to put the genie back in the bottle. But in many cases, what had happened at that point is you either had already a dead diplomat, and so you were focusing on physical security to try to keep the next diplomat alive. So there wasn't a lot of after-action reports into what actually transpired. Meaning when I first looked at the 1979 file in Tehran, You start looking, well, we had a embassy burned and ransacked in 79 as well. Then you start looking and say, oh my goodness, well, in Beirut in 76, you had an ambassador and an economics officer kidnapped and murdered. Then you start looking, and then you had an ambassador and another American murdered in Khartoum. And then you start looking back and you see all these other cases, predominantly in Central and Latin America, involving similar kind of attacks. And you're thinking, my goodness, how long has this been going on? And why isn't somebody doing anything about it? And but you think about it in concept, too, that if you only had 250 or 300 agents in the field, and a lot of those folks were at headquarters, what could you really do? You were lucky to send one agent that would be assigned, for example, out of Panama, and his job, and they were mostly men in those days, their job was to regionally stay on top of all these issues. So they were just like smoke jumpers or firemen. They were responding to threat to threat to threat. And you had guys like Jack Hurst that was deemed to be a troubleshooter, and his job was just to go put out fires. And when he wasn't doing that, he was conducting investigations for DEA and the FBI. So you had folks just multitasking all over the place. And then you had other foreign diplomatic missions that had very limited, if any, security personnel at all. So it wasn't unusual for some foreign diplomatic missions in the 70s to not have any security personnel. They may have a military attaché assigned.
Seeing how these threats do proliferate, and we are actually seeing new threats emerge, and the fact the world is no less dangerous now, if anything, it's more dangerous, what can be done to really secure embassies and personnel overseas?
Well, first and foremost, it takes a robust host nation responsibility to take ownership of the protection of those diplomats, regardless of what nation states they're from. And for the most part, governments get that right. We do a wonderful job here in the United States protecting resident foreign officials, internationally protected persons they're called, diplomats to the layman. For the most part, governments do it right. It's only in places that are deteriorating where you have problems, such as Benghazi, or look what we're faced with in Afghanistan or Iraq, or now we're looking at an expeditionary kind of posting in Mogadishu. So when you look at these volatile areas, those are the places where things usually go south. But now you have a tremendous amount of intelligence community assets monitoring the day-to-day threat. You got the national security apparatus collecting intelligence. You got SIGINT, ELINT, HUMINT. It's a priority to look out for threats against American diplomats and other diplomats, because if we do pick up chatter of threats against other foreign diplomats, we do very quickly pass that along through liaison channels. But, at the end of the day, you can only do so much. But I think that the protection of American diplomats today has never been better when it pertains to our current state of affairs. I think Benghazi changed not only the way diplomatic security service protects diplomats in areas, but it also exposes weaknesses that help other nation states protect their diplomats. For example, we were never trained to protect diplomats when buildings were set on fire. You never expect that to happen. Well, maybe we should have, because in 79 they set the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad on fire, but we just weren't trained to do that. So other nations learn as well from the lessons that we have, and we readily share that with friendly nation states.
When I think about the years of warfare from World War II through Vietnam, war is a major undertaking, and we go into war as a country reluctantly and not altogether frequently. The kinds of learning curves, as we're now 14 years into Afghanistan, there's a different thought process, I think, in the American mind about warfare and what it actually means, because it's an everyday process. The kinds of lessons that you learn and the after-action sorts of critiques when you have a major intelligence failure such as Tehran or Islamabad or Benghazi, I think evolve more rapidly today because of the kind of world that we live in, whereas back then in the 70s, when the threats were known but they were isolated, they didn't bubble down to the American mainstream. You didn't have Americans thinking or walking around in fear or have massive
or congressional
phobias
hearings.
or congressional hearings based on those things. We seem to be more rapidly assessing the failures and course correcting now because of the tempo of operations, whereas in the 70s, it was known, but it was more rare. Is that your feeling?
It is. I think, first off, tragedy forces change. And usually it takes horrific tragedy to force bureaucratic change, like we saw in Benghazi. Or you can go back to the Munich Olympics in 72 with the Israeli athletes that were held hostage by Black September. Then the entire special event management and the protection of athletes changes. And that's just what governments do. For the most part, I'm sad to say, governments are reactive. And they only change when they're forced to, or the American public or the public at large or Congress forces change. And that's just the nature of the beast. But I think that the security process and procedures do adapt. And in today's environment, Marla, they adapt very quickly, such as Benghazi. Well, let's train all the agents now to protect diplomats when buildings are set on fire. That makes sense. You would think that it probably would have made sense for us all to be trained after 79. But there you have it.
You've touched on a couple of different ways that the Iran crisis was a watershed moment, and there are a couple of more that come to mind as we think and talk about this. And one of them is the state of counter-surveillance as a protective measure, you said, didn't really exist back then. Can you talk to me a little bit about, number one, perimeter security? What was that like, and how did it fail into Iran? And then the second part is, when you think about the actual intelligence assets, how do you get rid of sensitive material if you're being breached?
Well, your last question first. Today, there's a very sophisticated process that diplomats and diplomatic security service agents and Marine security guards practice on the rapid destruction of classified information, so we don't have another Tehran where you have folks piecing together strips of classified data. There's cross-cut shredders, there's rapid deconstruction of materials, and so forth. On your question, and that's also practiced, and the technology also today gives you a better opportunity to destroy things quickly. Also, to your first question on counter-surveillance, well, it didn't exist until the mid to late 1980s because I was part of the original group that started looking at the effectiveness of counter-surveillance, literally having assets on the perimeter look for pre-operational surveillance before attack variables can start to unfold. In those days, back in 79, there was no such thing. So the innovation just wasn't there. So in essence, what you have is that nation state responsible for the perimeter security, and if they lose control of that nation state, like we saw in 79, or like we saw in Benghazi, where the guards may also become the enemy at times, then you really do have a problem. And then you're left with nothing but the ability to retreat to a safe haven and hunker down and wait for help kind of mindset while you're simultaneously making notifications and destroying classified material to include communications material so they don't fall in the hands of that nation state or the terrorist.
And another thing to consider is that back then there was a huge amount of material, actual physical material to destroy. You had papers, files, things that you had to either burn or shred. And it was almost impossible to actually destroy the volume of material that was required in the time frame. Whereas now, so much of what we do is actually, it's digital, be it files, audio files, encrypted data. It's in a digital format. It's stored in a retrieval system, which makes it a lot easier to wipe or actually destroy, or at least make sure that somebody can't get their hands on it. Whereas back then, it was a lot more difficult.
So you touched on cybersecurity as an aspect of espionage, and in essence, we're talking about asymmetrical threats, and that is the shape of the threat today as we know it. How else has the intelligence community's thinking about asymmetric threats changed since 1979? And in your mindset, is there anything that hasn't changed enough?
Well, I think there's some bureaucratic changes inside the State Department that haven't been effective enough, meaning if you still look at a flow chart of the State Department, you'll see the Diplomatic Security Service is still buried underneath the management chain inside of Foggy Bottom. And until, in my assessment, the Diplomatic Security Service is elevated to an undersecretary position where they can directly interface with the Secretary of State and say, at times this isn't a good idea, or maybe we shouldn't be in places like Benghazi or Mogadishu. And perhaps whoever's thinking about that should go watch Black Hawk Down. So I think at times you need folks that can look at the decision maker eye to eye and say, look, from a security perspective, this isn't good to do. Historically, the State Department's security team has always gone wherever the mission is, and at times that's been in very volatile areas. So in essence, from a bureaucratic perspective, there's a lot of change that needs to take place there. Having said that, from the intelligence community perspective, today at the embassies, back in 1979, you had a single State Department agent in Tehran, period. That's one guy doing the best he can, and he was in his 20s, if memory serves me right. So think about that from a responsibility perspective. Then today, at a similar-sized embassy overseas, you're going to have a huge operation with a senior regional security officer and a deputy, and you're going to have an agent in charge of the ambassador's protection with an entire bodyguard program on the U.S. ambassador and any other diplomat that may be venturing out into areas that may be dangerous. You also had an embassy. You have a very robust defense program with Marine security guards. You have defense attaches. At times you have FBI legal attaches, Secret Service agents, DEA agents, DHS agents, IRS agents even at some of the bigger embassies. So all the cops are able to get in one room and sit down and talk to the CIA, for example, and say, okay, this is what we're going to do about this problem. So it's just miles ahead when you start looking at that just from an intelligence interface perspective. And then you have the ability to reach back to Washington to say, look, what do you folks think about this? This is what we're seeing, or this is what we're hearing. So the problem with that, though, is, again, much like we see here at Stratfor at times, is there's so much information. How do you make sense of the white noise? And how do you get down to that tactical analysis that is actually going to keep people alive?
Well, Fred, there's always so much to be learned from these historical incidents. They really do continue to inform the way we think and operate in security circles today. So thank you for this fascinating discussion.
And that's our show for today. Once again, if you have any questions or comments to share, please drop us a line at stratfor.com/podcast/feedback. Be sure to give us your full name and an idea of how to pronounce it, as well as the city and the country you're writing from.
In the meantime, if you'd like to stay up on any of the topics we discussed today, be sure to visit stratfor.com for the latest insights and analysis. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time.